actually, we were talking about this earlier, weren't we? That actually, and I'm sure many of the attendees tonight would agree with this, but it's very ironic, isn't it, when it's actually very often non-autistic people that seem to demonstrate a lack of theory of mind or see. And I think, you know, relating to the topic of advocacy, from my perspective, people that don't see it as important, they tend to not have ever experienced that marginalisation that you were talking about, and it comes across a lot in the contacts that I receive in emails and communication, and you know, that oppression really, and living with that day in day out, and trying to fit into a world that's not really, it's not even trying to meet people's needs. So
yeah, I think part of the issue is that when people say, I'm just aware that I wanted to say some more about what advocacy is in practice, but just to kind of finish off this bit,
yeah,
just reminding myself so I don't let that one go, because there's more to say on that. But in terms of people, one thing that I've realized is that when people are telling you that you don't seem autistic, a lot of the time they think they're being polite. They think it's a compliment.
yeah,
You know, because they think that they think that kind of letting one's, you know, seeming autistic is a bad thing. You know, so they think that by saying you don't seem autistic, or you know, you manage to cover it up well, or you manage to cope well, they think that that's kind of a compliment. And I mean, I know, for example, on my diagnostic report, because I was diagnosed a long time ago, back in the dark ages, as a teenager, well, in my late teens, and the psychologist who diagnosed me put on my report, and I remember him telling my mum, who was with me, and I think he thought this was kind of reassuring to her, that actually I would probably grow out of my diagnosis, because I would learn kind of coping behaviors, and of course, like, we know, and it's much more accepted now, although probably not as accepted as it should be, that actually that process of learning how to, what we now talk about as being to mask or to camouflage, is actually extremely exhausting, and fundamentally puts us at a disadvantage compared with the neurotypical or the non-autistic majority, who don't have to make all those efforts in order to be socially accepted. So there's an awful lot behind the scenes when you say that somebody doesn't look autistic, and there are lots of ways in which I think it reproduces a kind of a prejudice that people think that they're trying to, you know, to challenge. People think that they're, you know, that they're being kind of progressive and complimentary, when actually all they're doing is reproducing the idea that it's a bad thing to
reinforcing it really, that the idea of one way of being, you know, there's one way of being, and we need
it's
to
similar to you know how historically in this country, and to an extent still, this is still the case, particularly I think in the States, it's been seen as progressive to refer to those of us who are disabled or who are autistic as people with disabilities or people with autism. And I know language is a really contested issue in the autistic community, and I don't want to, and so I would stress, of course, that everybody gets, you know, has the right to choose how they refer to themselves, and I'd never want to get in the way of that. But one of the ironies that always struck me with person first language, as we call it, so person with autism, is that it's seen as progressive because it distances the person from their autism, and it reminds, it's
Mhm.
the intention is to remind the listener or society at large that the person is very literally a person first. Well, I think if people need reminding that I'm a person, then we've got a bigger issue than
Yep.
the order of our words.
Therein lies the problem, really, doesn't it? We shouldn't
Well,
have to
yeah.
remind people.
But going back to advocacy, just to kind of, because I've sort of said the theoretical or the conceptual, that it's about voice, but what that might look like in practice, because I guess that's kind of helpful to get a picture in our minds of what it might involve. So I mean, there are various different models of advocacy that kind of happen in in our society as it is at the moment. So when I talk about advocacy in terms of what I used to do when I was an advocate, and what my colleagues at Advonet who work as advocates do now, is that we work on a one-to-one basis with people. So in my case, autistic people, and we're working around an issue. So, or I mean, it might be multiple issues, but usually there'll be one issue in a person's life. So it might be to do with where they're living, or it might be to do with their healthcare, or it might be to do with them trying to access support or family relationships, or an issue that's important in that person's life. And basically that person feels as though, or it's thought that that person would benefit from support in putting their views across into the decision making process. So an advocate doesn't, in this kind of work, doesn't make the decision on the person's behalf,
Yeah,
doesn't
very important.
doesn't give advice. That's an important thing to mention, actually, that advocates are not advice givers. um, what we do is we work with the person to help them access information that they need to help them think through the decision. So that might be, if it's a decision about for example, a medical treatment, it might be getting information about the treatment in a way that's accessible to the person, and kind
Yeah,
of giving, in particular with autistic people, it might be making sure that they've got processing time to think about the decision, and ways of going through the information that are kind of accessible, and that the person's not hurried through and rushed through the process. And then we make sure that the person is given the opportunity to communicate their views, and to have them heard. So that might involve going to meetings with a person and physically being there with them. Sometimes some of my clients would have wanted me to be in meetings with them. Sometimes they would rather I went to the meeting without them, and they actually didn't want to come. And that was fine. I'd have meetings with them beforehand, and
yeah,
we'd plan
yeah,
what they wanted to say, and then I'd go to the meeting and I'd feed back to the person. We'd do it like that. Or various ways of doing it. Or we might write letters to the person, the social worker, or the social work team manager, the service commissioner, whoever the kind of responsible person was, and we'd communicate the person's views that way. And then we support the person to kind of understand the decision once it had been made, and if they wanted to kind of appeal against that decision or whatever, then we can support with that. So that's kind of how advocacy would work on a kind of a one-to-one issue focused kind of way. Obviously there are different versions of that depending on the person's kind of intellectual ability and ability to participate. So You know, there are kind of things like non-instructed advocacy, where a person isn't able to tell you what they would want, or lots of things like that. And that I'm not going to talk about
Yeah,
in
and that
too much
must
detail
be,
today, but there are
we
those.
could have another webinar on that, Joe.